10,000 years, Manhattan will be nothing more than some hills on an island with nothing currently there standing, unless it is built from stone.
Manhattan will absolutely leave behind a tremendous amount of material culture in 10,000 years, probably more than the short-term hunter-gatherer camps regularly found from the Pleistocene. Even if New York was hit by an apocalyptic meteor shower with airbursts with the destructive power of small nukes, then inundated with miles-high sea waves, hypothetically, of course, believe it or not, I think it would still leave behind a lot of material culture. And of course, in that case, a whole hell of a lot of evidence of airbursts and mile-high sea waves.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Archaeology. I'm your host Bill Farley. Today I'm going to do something that I would not advise anyone to do. I'm going to make an entire YouTube video responding to a tweet, which is funny being from a website that I'm not really even participating at anymore because it's an absolute nightmare hellhole and is algorithmically designed to simply make me very, very angry all the time. So I've stopped going there. So go ahead and find me over on Blue Sky or somewhere else. Anyway, but what I want to talk about today is kind of in a roundabout way, talking about how archaeologists come to understand archaeological sites and also how we come to understand the artifacts that we find on archaeological sites. Because if you saw the tweet there at the beginning of the video, you'll see it was making what's a surprisingly common and extremely incorrect assumption or the repeating of a myth, I would say, that I've seen many times before, which is this kind of just a crass misunderstanding of how archaeological preservation works and a dismissal of pretty basic evidence to kind of throw around the notion that the archaeological sites form in a way that you kind of want them to instead of how we know them actually to in the real world. Now, I'll be honest, I don't think this sort of thing is good faith. This turned into actually a relatively interesting conversation, about as good faith as a conversation can be on a website like that. But it was still pretty bad faith compared to, I don't know, just being in real life and talking to human beings. But I'm going to do something that I think is kind of fun. I'm going to take it totally seriously. And we're going to try and answer this question of what would happen to a place like New York City in 10,000 years? Because the person who wrote this tweet has made an assumption that the only things that last are stone, right? Because New York is not made of stone, it won't be there in 10,000 years. That's an interesting sort of a supposition to interrogate. So let's do it. I'm going to do this with an extended case study that we'll get to in just a minute. But first, let's go over some sort of basics of kind of what this conversation is even about, right? So he's really bringing up a question about a topic in archaeology we call site formation processes, also sometimes called taphonomy, though that term has different meanings in different disciplines and sciences. For instance, it's also the term that's to describe how fossils are formed. I think it is a little bit like that, right? What taphonomy is, or site formation processes are, that second one is really tells you what it is right on the tin, right? It's how archaeological sites come to be. So not what things are. It's less about how artifacts got there in the first place. That's kind of more broadly what we're trying to do in archaeology. It's not about just determining what kind of artifacts people would have produced in a society or in a culture sometime in the past, but about everything that happens between when that site is abandoned, which is a little bit of an old-fashioned term, but let's say whatever, right? At some point, people are not there anymore at any given place. And the moment when we go there and we start to excavate and we start to find stuff, some amount of time passes. Depending on the kind of site, it might be hundreds of years, it might be thousands of years, it might be tens of thousands of years. And in that interim, the site will change a great deal, because not everything that's dropped on the ground or put there by people will remain. And that's because of something called preservation, which I'm going to get to in just a second. But the site itself will also alter. And we oftentimes kind of break down the different ways that a site can change over the course of thousands of years into two big broad categories. But ultimately, we should note that physically they're the same. They both are disturbing the site or altering it, but they're useful to break apart for reasons that are why we might be interested in them further. So one we might call natural transforms, and that's an old theoretical term for it, but those are natural things that alter the site over time. These are also sometimes called bioturbations if they're done by biological creatures. So it can be something like a rodent burrowing through your site, or earthworms moving stuff up and down in the stratigraphy, or something more obvious and extreme like frost heave cycles, or I don't know, like an earthquake or something like that can kind of move things around within a site, right? But things coming from the natural world. Alternatively, we can have cultural transforms. So these are alterations to the site that are made by humans later on. So as archaeologists, one of the reasons we separate these out is that cultural transforms are, of course, later elements of the archaeological site. They are human activity, even if they happened recently. We might still see them as archaeological, inherently archaeological, right? But this is later on, somebody comes along, they dig a hole for some reason, and that hole cuts through our stratigraphy, and it cuts through our features, and it moves artifacts around. Or a more obvious example is kind of where I work in New England, and in most places that have had long-term agriculture for hundreds of years, we get pretty much in almost every stratigraphy, we get called a plow zone. That's our first, 20, 30 centimeters. It's just has been plowed over and over again for probably 200-300 years, if not longer. And artifacts within that section of the site are going to have been moved, usually more up and down than side to side. Still useful, still interesting, still can tell us a lot about the archaeological site, but we lose some information there, right? So this process of site formation studies is a huge part of what we do as archaeologists. It's kind of what we spend most of our actual time doing in the field and even afterwards, because recreating all this, understanding this, will help us to understand the finds that we find, right? Because we have to know really comfortably. I've talked about a ton on this channel before. We have to understand the spatial and temporal context of our artifacts. That is to say, where are they in space and where are they in time, and how do they relate to other artifacts? So if an artifact has been moved from its original location by a gopher or a person digging a privy hole, that's going to move an artifact around, and we need to understand that. So huge part of what we did. Now, I mentioned before, the last element of this is preservation, and this is really going to come in big time with this hypothetical discussion that we're having about New York City over 10,000 years. A better way to think about preservation is actually to think about differential preservation, which is to say every single object has a more or less likely chance to preserve over time. Some artifacts, as the poster rightly points out, like stone, are effectively forever, at least on archaeological timescales, except in quite rare circumstances where you've got serious erosion or something like that. Most of the time, if you've got an artifact made of stone, whether that's a building or an artifact, stone tool or something, 10,000 years later is nothing to stones, right? Stones are already millions or even billions of years old when we find them, right? So when somebody alters them and turns them into an artifact. So 10,000 years is nothing to a rock. It's going to effectively look the same as it did when it went in the ground, probably. Maybe not quite as resilient, but not too far off, are like ceramics. Ceramics, because they're made of clay, and other natural inorganic materials, oftentimes will last for many thousands of years without looking too different. So those are some of our most common types of archaeological finds, and those have high levels of preservation. They're unlikely to break down for any reason over time. Contrast that with anything that's made of organic materials, which we know from longtime viewers of the channel will know, hugely important for something like radiocarbon dating, but also just because we as humans use organic materials a lot. So that's fabrics, most fabrics, all
all of our foodstuffs, seeds and botanicals, as well as faunal material, stuff from animals, most of our clothing, a lot of housing material. So much of what we use are organic, and those sorts of materials have less preservational durability than things like stone and ceramic. But they do still preserve over long spans of time, and sometimes tens of thousands of years is not unusual. We still find materials like that on 10,000-year-old sites all the time. That's actually not that uncommon, but those things can preserve even longer or even more in their original shape and form, that they're easily identifiable if they are in exceptional preservational circumstances. So for instance, if a site is waterlogged, or it's extremely dry, or a couple of other elements like that, we end up with sites like the bog bodies, or anything that's been mummified, whether we're talking about mummified mummies that are intentionally mummified by people, or sometimes material is unintentionally mummified just by being in a very dry setting, or like Otzi, who was kind of frozen in ice, right? Or a lot of underwater sites. There's a lot of sites that are submerged under cold oceans, and they preserve an incredible, you find wood with paint on them, and it looks like they went into the water yesterday, and they're thousands of years old. So there are exceptional preservational circumstances like that. And even within a given site, you can have a site that's not entirely submerged underwater or something, right? But parts of the site might be. So Mesa Verde comes to mind, which is a site in South America. That's a pre-Clovis site, and that's a site that's like semi-submerged. It's been submerged during certain elements, so it has this exceptional preservation. Other sites, the parts of the site are not so much. So that's not unusual either. Now, I only mentioned stones and ceramics, but there are other objects, things like mud bricks, that will preserve a really long time for that same reason. That's going to be relevant in just a second here. The final form of exceptional preservation is charring, which is our most common. Almost every archaeological site has some charred materials, and this is the primary way by which we get organic material preserved. So that's like, you have a hearth, right? You have a hearth fire in your house, and everything that burns in there, and the charcoal that's in there will preserve, because by charring it, you're kind of removing everything about it that makes it enticing to critters and parasites and small cell organisms and stuff like that. So all right, we've laid the framework. That's a lot of definitions, but that's kind of the educational part of the video. So I want you to kind of be with that. I did, however, just want to bring our attention back to this idea of New York City, because I hope that you can start to see the sort of absurdity of this idea that nothing would be left in New York City, because I didn't give you this context originally, but of course this conversation was happening within some sort of a discussion about ancient apocalypse and about Graham Hancock's work and stuff like that. And this is a really important part of those sort of pseudo-archaeological analyses. They really need, it's important that certain types of sites can simply disappear, and uncomfortably, in an unfortunate way for them, those tend to have to be the sites that would most likely preserve, and the ones that aren't likely to preserve are supposed to have survived. So going back to ancient apocalypse, talking about Atlantis or some sort of ancient civilization, the thinking has to go that huge Atlantean cities, perhaps with advanced technology that we would even find futuristic, or at least modern by our standards, or semi-modern, would be completely gone, invisible to the archaeological record, because we've never found any site like this ever in the world, and we continue to never find any sites like this anywhere in the world. And I understand the counter argument. Well, maybe there's some places we haven't looked yet. That counter argument sucks. So I would say, if you're typing that comment already, I guess finish it, whatever, help out the algorithm, find me or whatever. I don't give a shit. But it's not a good argument, because we've looked a lot of places, and you're just doing a sort of gods of the gaps argument, right? Well, if we just we just whatever the Atlantean site's going to be in the next place we haven't looked. Oh, and we've thoroughly observed this part of the world. Maybe it'll be in another part of the world, right? We'll just keep moving it forever, I guess. And then maybe it's on the bottom of the ocean. Maybe it's on the moon. Maybe it's on fucking Neptune. I don't fucking know. So we're never gonna find it because the sites very likely are not there. But these sites would leave behind a lot of archaeological material. Kind of like New York City would, right? So let's contrast New York City with an actual 10,000-year-old city, and one perhaps you've heard of called Çatalhöyük, which is in Turkey, and is a site that's been featured in many pseudo-archaeological programs over the years. And it is a remarkable, marvelous site that is around 10,000 years old at its oldest layers. And it's one of the first, if not maybe the first, urban center in the world. And it's built out of mud brick and has tons of organic material that we wouldn't think of as necessarily preserving. And it's about 34 acres in size, and at its maximum had a population of as many as 10,000 people, though that estimate's actually been kind of pushed down a little bit over the years. It was originally believed to be that high, and now maybe it's more like 6,000 or 7,000. So that's pretty big for a city of 10,000 years ago. And this is an enormous archaeological site. There's been excavations ongoing there for many decades at this point, and there will continue for the rest of our lifetimes and beyond. And it's just an incredible site. So note those size, 34 acres, and we'll give it 10,000. We'll be optimistic and say a population density of 10,000. New York City is 302 square miles in size. Now that's a little bit inclusive, right? I didn't get just Manhattans. And its population as of 2023 is a little below 8.3 million. So that's a little larger than Çatalhöyük, just a little bit bigger than Çatalhöyük. And let's start with the easy stuff. Let's start with the low-hanging fruit. Quite a lot of New York City is in fact built of stone. There's a lot of buildings in New York City that include stonework. There's a lot of stone and both artificial and natural stones all over New York City. There's also a lot of materials like intense high tensile steel and other metals that likely would last 10,000 years without any exceptional preservational circumstances. There's also just such an absolutely enormous amount of organic materials like wood that those things, some percentage of those would last 10,000 years as well. Very unlikely to go anywhere. And we should point out, in terms of exceptional preservational circumstances, much of New York, especially Manhattan, is so-called reclaimed land, which means it's areas that have been reclaimed from waterways by basically dumping trash in them until they became land. And those are exceptional preservational circumstances. I actually worked on a project in Boston like that one time, and we were finding coconut shells and perfectly preserved West African seeds that were 400 years old that hadn't aged a day because they're in this really deoxygenated mud soils, kind of clay soils that were effectively like a riverbed, like a harbor bed, I guess you'd say. And we pulled up cribbing from those, which are these wooden structures, and we were able to use dendrochronology on them because the wood was perfectly preserved. You could see every ring, and they were from the 1630s, so about 400 years old. Not 10,000 years old, but they hadn't aged a day in about 400. I'm not sure why we would expect them to suddenly start to degrade to nothing in the following 9,500, right? So that's a relatively recent example. But even in New York, there's been excavations, for instance, in the building of the New World Trade Center, where archaeologists and excavators found incredibly preserved materials from the 17th and 18th century that were preserved in the same way. Much of the city would be in those sort of circumstances if it was buried under mile high waves. So we have to come back to this being not a good faith criticism in the end, because it relies on it's searching for an answer to a question that needs to be answered, right? So again, this is why it's pseudoscience. It's like the opposite of science. It's not coming up with a hypothesis and testing it. It's a belief. The belief is these ancient cities existed, And there's a problem in that we've never found them as archaeologists. So we have to come up with reasons why we've never found them. Well, maybe one reason why is they wouldn't preserve because they're simply too old. 10,000-year-old city would never preserve. That's unfortunately untrue. We find 10,000-year-old archaeological sites that are tiny, small, hunter-gatherer, single households from 10,000 plus years ago all the time. There's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of sites like that all over the world, in every part of the world, where people lived at that time period. So the idea that a huge city, a city that was more like New York than like Çatalhöyük, that wouldn't preserve 10,000 years on is incorrect. New York City would leave behind an incredible amount of material culture. Archaeologists excavating New York City in the year 12,000 AD would find so much material culture they wouldn't know what to do with it. It would be impossible to study the trash and detritus of literally tens of millions of people living in a space over the course of decades and centuries, and in the most intensive way one can imagine, and massive projects that bring together the labor of thousands of individuals to build skyscrapers and things that we would probably interpret as archaeologists to be temples and palaces and ziggurats and pyramids and whatever else, right? Grand works on that sort of scale from our society, from our culture living today. The idea that all those things would be gone, they wouldn't look like they do today. It would look different. It would look like an archaeological site. Of course, it would be regrown over. It would be partially buried. It would look like the works of Ozymandias. I have no doubt, but it would be there, and it would not be hard to find as archaeologists. There'd be a great deal probably still on the surface, even in 10,000 years. And again, this last point about apocalyptic meteor showers and airbursts and mile-high waves. Well, the other challenge is that these folks have never found any evidence of any of those things either. The evidence for that is really shoddy, and there should be a lot more of it because this would be such a massive global event. And I'm sure somebody in the comments will be sharing some bullshit study that shows that, it might have been hot in this one place one time. The evidence doesn't support it. There's just not evidence for this wide scale apocalyptic thing that would somehow wipe out a city building civilization, making cities on the scale of a place like New York 10,000 years ago, and just leave nothing behind. Because, as we've just learned, a huge amount of material from New York City would survive. A huge amount of material from Çatalhöyük survives 10,000 years later. And again, we're talking generously 10,000 people living in that site at one time, compared to over 8 million in New York nowadays. So even a site that was just a few times larger than Çatalhöyük, and we're talking about sites like the ones we might see in Mesopotamia. Those sites are nearly 10,000 years old, and they leave behind tells. They're unnatural mountains in the middle of the desert, and you dig into them, and they're huge cities built atop cities of top cities. Look at all the recent research in the rainforests of Central and South America that are just finding these enormous complexes and cities that are just there. Local people have known about them. We needed some technology to find them. I suspect in 10,000 years we'll have pretty good technology for discovering archaeological sites. So anyway, at the end of the day, it's a fun little exercise to think about. It's an opportunity to think about these processes. But if you're sort of wading through these theories of what kind of archaeology should exist from ancient civilizations 10,000 years ago, a site like New York of that sort of size would leave just an incredible amount behind. So I'm going to leave it off there. This was very, very chill, very relaxed, just literally a video about responding to a tweet. So I wish I could say it's the last time I'm going to do that, but probably not, because they're pretty interesting stuff. But like I said, there'll probably be replies to skeets. Oh God, are we calling them skeets? I hope we're not calling them skeets, right? Whatever they call them on Blue Sky. Posts. Let's just call them posts. It's fine. Don't call them tweets though. That's just rude. So go find me there. Of course, click subscribe here on this channel for more stuff like this, and I'll see you next time. Everybody, have a great weekend.